You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. With 4 days to go until Election Day, we continue our series on the road of special shows from around the United States. The latest polls indicate that this race will come down to the wire. So what's at stake, and how can those candidates hoover up the last few undecided voters? I'm Chris Lord, this is the Monocle Daily, live from Atlanta, and it starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord. In 4 days' time, America's electoral system will be put to the ultimate test. This election is happening at a moment when trust in the country's institutions is fraying at the seams. The Republican candidate, former President Donald Trump, is already alleging fraud in Pennsylvania on the last day of early voting. We'll discuss that with a former federal prosecutor and a community leader to look at how the next administration can restore faith in the justice system and the police itself. Plus, are the Democrats slipping in New York? Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. So welcome indeed to a special edition of the Monocle Daily, coming to you live from the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. It's just over a month ago when we had Hurricane Helene and then the double whammy of Hurricane Milton tear through communities all over the southeast of America. Indeed, many people in this country are still picking up the pieces. Well, I'm very glad to say I'm joined here by Amir Farokhi. He's a city councillor in Atlanta. He's also executive director of US programs at CARE, which is a humanitarian organisation that provides relief work and indeed provided work in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Amir, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining the Monocle Daily. Many Americans around the southeast are still without homes, without livelihoods, I think especially up there in North Carolina. How long do you think it will be before this region starts to recover fully from the hurricane?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and welcome to Atlanta.
Thank you.
The Hurricane Helene and Milton, but especially Helene, were catastrophic in scale in ways that I don't think were anticipated, even though it was a pretty heralded storm before it hit. And to your question, I don't think we know. I think there's parts of the storm's path that will be quicker to recover just because the geography allows it, Florida, for example. But you get up into the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, and the topography just makes it very, very difficult. Major roads are washed out, power is tough to get back on. And so I think you're going to see a many months long process to make it start to feel somewhat accessible, somewhat normal. But the psychological and economic impact will be felt for years.
Some of those affected have said, they've voiced their frustrations that they've had delays in getting federal aid to where they are. I just wonder, we're so close to Election Day. Do you worry that these events will have shaken faith in some of these very important states in this election?
Yeah, look, I think we exist at a time in which there's decreasing confidence in all sorts of institutions, government first among them. And this is an opportunity for government to build trust in looking out for people and protecting people who have been hit by a catastrophic storm. So I can't speak for all the voters. I think the bigger challenge is access. Can you make sure people can exercise their right to vote? But certainly the federal government's response will shape some of those voters' approach and who they may vote for in the presidential election.
I should say you can probably hear quite a lot of planes going over us. We are on a bit of a flight path here, and we are open air in Atlanta, Georgia. But anyway, we'll push on. Look, you make the point there about whether voters, if you like, whether their voiced concerns are being met. And you're here talking to voters here in Georgia. When you talk to them, what do they need to hear, do you think, from these candidates? There've been so many visits, I think 40 combined since August by both candidates. Are there messages cutting through? What are you hearing when you're talking to Atlantans about this election? Do they feel engaged? Do they feel like they're being heard?
It's a great question. I think the answer to that is complicated and both simple. I think the simple answer is we are such a divided nation that supporters of former President Trump and supporters of Kamala Harris oftentimes are like ships passing in the night. They don't even speak the same language, right? They see the world through very different lenses. There's obviously a subset of voters who are swingable, right? And that's who the messaging tends to be targeted toward. And I think the issue that resonates across party lines is almost always the economy. That's true this election cycle as well. But you get kind of beyond that, and you start to see different issues be more important to either side. On Republicans, it's public safety, it's immigration. Democrats, it's oftentimes reproductive rights, as well as other economic inclusive access issues. But it's the economy that's probably the issue that is both parties are really harping on for those swing voters.
You're a councilman right here in where we are in Atlanta, Georgia, right in this area. This is an area that's seen profound change in recent years. So many people moving in, many of them quite often with very different views from the people who already lived here. There's been a lot of inflows from California, from New York and elsewhere. Has enough been done, do you think, to still talk to those people who are here, who are undecided, the ones who were here before, to make them, bring them along, if you like, with some of the demographic change that's happened here?
Well, I think that question assumes that the folks that were here before don't also share views of folks who come here. In fact, there was a study done sometime in the last decade that showed that when people move someplace new, they actually adopt the politics of the place in which they move. There's probably some truth in the middle there, that you're also bringing your politics as well. We see evidence of that. But I think Georgians, whether you're a new Georgian or you've been here for generations, you pretty quickly have a subset of issues that you care about that are uniform across the state. Now, you may care about something different if you're a farmer in Southeast Georgia than if you're a lawyer here in Atlanta. And that's where you determine whether candidates are speaking to your needs or not. But I think the issues that are important to new transplants are oftentimes in line with issues of folks who've been here for decades.
A really simple question. I know you're, as a council member, you're non-partisan. I know you've made it clear that you've voted for Kamala Harris. But, when you talk to people here, what do they feel about being in a swing state? There is so much focus on this part of the country. How is that interpreted by Georgians day to day? What do they feel about that? Almost sense of responsibility, if you like.
4 years ago was a bit of a surreal experience because we had not been a swing state for decades. And then all of a sudden we were. And some of that's due to the demographic shifts that have happened here, both immigration, folks moving from around the country. Most of that population growth has been in Metro Atlanta, not other parts of the state.
I think there is a fundamental question here about how people relate when they're given a sense that they kind of have the country's weight on their shoulders sometimes about how they vote might ultimately shape this election.
Yeah, but I think that the reality of being a swing state is at both times flattering and exhausting. The pace with which candidates are spending time here and money here, whether it's manifested in television ads coming at you nonstop.
Do people feel exhausted by that?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think that's true in all the swing states, right? But at the same time, the alternative is if you live in a state like California or New York, you feel like your vote doesn't matter because it's either so democratic or otherwise. And so I think there's a sense of responsibility that Georgia voters feel like they have because they know that how the state goes could very well tip the election one way or the other. But it's also exhausting, let's be honest.
Absolutely. Your organisation, Caren, has a long history of doing relief work with Palestinians and in the Middle East, and I know that's something that you not directly involved in yourself. But there is a big Arab American population here in Georgia, and I know there have been state representatives who've been very involved in the uncommitted movement, those people who said that they couldn't vote for Joe Biden in the primaries because they felt, even though they were lifelong Democrats, because they didn't agree with the administration's attitude towards the war in Gaza. I just wondered, from your perspective, how concerned are you when we get to Election Day that, frankly, those people still won't be decided, that they won't be able to say, look, I can go ahead and vote as I usually do, even if I fundamentally disagree with this administration? Do you worry about that here in Georgia?
Sure. I think the challenge of the Democratic Party is that it's a Big Tent party, right? And you have enormously disparate viewpoints within the party. There's a huge population of Jewish Americans that have been and will vote for Democrats come hell or high water, who are very much pro-Israel in this moment. And then you have kind of a growing voter base. You see it most probably publicly in Michigan, but also here, of Arab and Middle Eastern Americans who have been disenchanted with the Biden administration's response to the Israel-Gaza conflict. And so anytime you risk losing voters or seeing them sit on the sidelines in a race that's razor close, razor thin, it's concerning. But it's a very difficult tightrope to walk for Democratic leadership, and you've seen that over the last few months that no one's happy half the time.
Well, Amir Farokhi, thank you so much for joining us, council member here in Atlanta, Georgia. Great to have you on the program. Thank you.
Pleasure.
The world will be watching when Americans vote on Tuesday to find out just what kind of America they'll be dealing with on the global stage over the next 4 years. Many Americans have become fatigued by the country's engagement in foreign conflicts, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan. And Monocle's Chris Chermak has been in Washington, D.C. for us this week. He spoke to Natalie Gonnella-Platts, Director of Global Policy at the George W. Bush Presidential Center, about the importance of American foreign engagement. They started by talking about how the U.S. role in Afghanistan has shifted since ending its military engagement there.
So the Bush Institute will always endure as an ally to the Afghan people and those who stand by the people of Afghanistan. And so what's interesting is that I don't think the way we do our work has changed. In the past, a lot of that work was more programmatic in nature. So for example, at the Institute, we had leadership programs that included incredible Afghan advocates alongside other women who are doing tremendous things in support of their communities and countries. But, you know, the experience of these women and all that they have done in pursuit of peace and prosperity and their direct affiliation with us amid other U.S. institutions, you know, put them at direct risk. So, you know, it's more difficult to do work like that these days, but, you know, that's the beauty of an institution like ours, the platform we have, being able to pivot. And so we have facilitated things like working groups with Afghan education advocates, using our convening capacity to bring them together to share best practices, to, you know, process the trauma and the barriers that they face day in and day out, and to inform the robust package of policy work that we continue to put out. And, you know, at the Institute, we say, our CEO, Ken Hirsch, said at our annual Forum on Leadership this year, he opened it with, we are unapologetically globalist, and we believe that U.S. engagement in the world matters. What happens around the world matters to us here at home. How people live has an effect. And so we remain deeply committed to that. And much of the work that we are doing as an institute is focused on concrete policy recommendations, direct actions that influencers can take to hold the Taliban and their enablers to account for the atrocities that are being committed day in and day out. And where that relates then back to the U.S. posture and the posture of the global community is really highlighting that there is a roadmap forward. Yes, leverage has changed, right? That's obvious. Nobody can dispute that. But there are a number of mechanisms that exist. The Taliban are absolutely desperate for official recognition, legitimacy on the world stage. Unfortunately, we are not currently using the mechanisms that exist to their full extent and impact, nor have we really enhanced a lot of the mechanisms that exist or that could be introduced. And so a lot of the work I have done and my colleagues have done through this Captured State report and other efforts is very much focused on that.
How do you make the case these days for global engagement, given that, as you talked about, being unapologetically globalist as an organization, there is more of that isolationist tendency in the U.S. these days? It is a topic of these elections. How do you make the case that that should not be how we look at the world?
This is such a critically important question. And if you look across U.S. history, a more isolationist posture really has never worked out in U.S. interest. So first and foremost, there's that, right? We have a lot of lessons to learn from history. The second thing that I think about quite a lot in my work, and I know my colleagues across our global policy team do as well, whether it's our efforts on global health and programs like the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or our efforts, for example, in support of North Korean refugees and the human rights atrocities taking place there, is the fact that all of this is deeply, deeply intertwined with our state of peace and security here in the United States, right? Nothing that is destabilizing stays contained. And I think in the case of Afghanistan, you know, everyone tries to compartmentalize it, to think of it as this isolated situation. It's a power vacuum, but it's an isolated power vacuum, right? And that couldn't be further from the truth. And right now, when you see democratic backsliding that continues to escalate and has escalated over the last 2 years everywhere around the world, and the fact that autocracies, from the Russias and Chinas of the world to other illiberal actors like extremist organizations, you know, they're working together, they're learning from each other. Now more than ever is a very clear case for why U.S. engagement in the world matters. And quite frankly, when the U.S. leads, others follow. And when the U.S. abstains from engaging, you know, there are catastrophic implications. And again, you can look at history just across the 20th century to find a multitude of examples. I will note, it is hard to compel people who are, also thinking about things like kitchen table issues to understand why Afghanistan or North Korea or HIV in Africa impacts them. But it does deeply. And I think that's one of the unique contributions we have as the Bush Institute is our ability to really be a bridge, not just in engaging influencers, but also, the American public and communities across the U.S. and across the world to understand why it benefits us all to have an engaged United States.
Natalie Gonnella-Platts there of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in conversation with our very own Chris Chermak. Thanks to you both. Welcome back to the Monocle Daily. Live from Atlanta, Georgia, I'm Chris Lord. Americans' faith in the institutions that hold this country together are fraying at the seams. From the Supreme Court to the electoral system itself, polling company Gallup has found in recent years all-time lows of public confidence. But trust in the police that justice is being fairly meted out has hit all-time lows. Since 2020 and the national backlash against police violence that led to calls to defund police departments. Since then, many cities have struggled with rises in violent crime and a perception that justice is not being served. Well, I'm joined now in our Beltline studio by Caren Morrison, who is Associate Professor of Law at Georgia State University. She was previously an Assistant US Attorney in the Eastern District of New York. Great to have you with us, Caren.
Thank you.
And also by Reverend Markel Hutchins, who's a civil rights leader and CEO of Movement Forward, and he also leads Faith and Blue weekends all over the state and indeed around the country as well. Thank you both for joining us. Reverend Markel, if I may start with you. For years, as we just said, Americans' faith in law enforcement has been declining. Very steep after 2020. The communities that you talk to, what does that do in terms of their overall faith about the health of institutions in this country, the way that that seeps into a broader view about what's happening in the US?
It's detrimental in many ways because for most Americans, the front face of governmental authority and power rests in the criminal justice system, most especially in police. Most people's interaction, particularly negatively with our government, stems from their interaction with law enforcement. So in a lot of ways, police officers and law enforcement officials are the front face of governmental authority in the United States. So when these tensions between law enforcement and communities mount, it really undermines the public confidence in our system of governance. And I think you can see that playing out in a bunch of different ways, even in this election cycle in the United States of America. Many people are disillusioned and the issues around policing have become front and center for a lot of voters, particularly in minority and other disenfranchised communities.
There is a perception that communities of colour want to see less policing in their communities, and I know that's something you've actually actively challenged that view, haven't you?
Well, it's not the case. Most people in communities of color want not less policing, but want more policing. Everyone wants to be policed with equity and fairness and justice. People don't want to be profiled or harassed because of the color of their skin or their gender or who they love or where they worship or how they choose to live out their lives. But people want to be policed with fairness and equity. The most important civil or civil challenge that we see in America today is crime and violence. So people of color, people in communities of color don't want less policing, they want fair policing. And in a lot of ways, the narrative that we've seen over the last several years, particularly around defund the police, is a minority view, even in minority communities. So it is incumbent upon all of us to have these conversations about how we make policing and criminal justice better and not take away resources, but allocate those resources in a way that are just and fair.
Caren Morrison, both candidates throughout this election have returned time and time again to saying that they are tough on crime. And, we go right back to Nixon, the law and order president, and so on. Every election cycle this plays out, but I wonder here, what does that even mean anymore when a candidate comes forward and says tough on crime? Is that just pure rhetoric? Is there anything left to be done in that sense to say that they are tough on crime?
Well, I think what's interesting is if Donald Trump says he's tough on crime, he's talking about a particular kind of crime, which is not white-collar crime, not white person crime, but sort of person on the street, people getting mugged on the street, or particularly in his campaign, the rare occasion when an immigrant person murders somebody, a citizen or something like that. So his view of crime is very racially tinged, very class tinged. He's not talking about his buddies his CEO buddies or anything like that. And obviously, as somebody who's been indicted 4 times, in 4 different jurisdictions, it's quite ironic that he's saying that he's, for law and order. But it's a very particular kind of law and order he's talking about. He is talking about racial profiling. He is talking about a very active and aggressive police presence in inner cities. He keeps calling, communities of color garbage and awful, horrible places with terrible things going on. It's a very old-fashioned white supremacist kind of view of crime, and it's not. I don't really think it does reflect actually what's happening in the country.
And curiously, when you look at the figures, actually, rates of violent crime have been coming down. Obviously, we did see heights after 2020, and then there were significant concerning rises. But there are rates of coming down. I just wonder how you understand, despite that, why is there still that stubborn view among so many Americans that their cities are getting more dangerous? Why do they feel that even when the rates of crime start to come down?
I think it's a question of salience rather than really frequency. It's any awful crime that happens, every college student who's murdered violently or something, it's so gripping and horrible, and the news makes so much of it that it seems like it's happening a lot more than it really is. Even something like in the New York subways where there's been the occasional shooting or stabbing, if you think about the millions and millions and millions of people who travel on the subway, it's extremely rare. But the fact that it happens at all, everybody gets all panicky. But the rates of crime compared to the 80s are microscopically smaller than they used to be. We are still in a fairly low crime environment. It just doesn't feel like that.
And I agree with Caren completely. For one thing, we have, at this point in history, more so than ever before, everybody is a reporter because everyone has, or journalists on some level, because everyone has access to technology that allows the crimes that happen to be amplified and for people to know more about them. In a lot of ways, it's a very good thing, but in some ways, it's also a very dangerous thing because it allows and affords people an opportunity to have a misperception about crime. The fact of the matter is, in Atlanta and Chicago and Detroit and Washington and other primarily African-American cities, crime is decreasing. But as the professor suggested, because of the salience and the visibility of these crimes, it gives someone like Donald Trump an opportunity to misuse those crimes for political purposes. So it's really, in my estimation, more about who has a microphone and a megaphone than the reality of what's happening in our country. The truth of the matter is, we are safer today than we were under Trump's presidency, and we're safer today than we were under Ronald Reagan's presidency.
Markel, I know you go into communities and you try to foster those, frankly, that faith in the men in blue, or the men and women in blue, the people who protect people every day. You go in and you try to forge those links. From that next administration, whoever that might be, Donald Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris, what would you like to see them do at a federal level to help make the job that you're trying to do ultimately easier?
For one, there needs to be more intentionality from the federal government level about causing law enforcement authorities, be they U.S. attorneys or local police officers, to be more directly engaged with the people that they're policing. The thing that I hear across this country, and I think that you probably hear the same thing, Professor, is people want to play a more active role in their public safety. But that requires that law enforcement transition and transform more than reform, but to transform from this warrior-based style of policing to more of a servant-based style. People want to be protected. They want to be served, but the idea that police are the boogeyman is one that has been pervasive for the last 50 years in America, and most law enforcement agencies want to change that. So when you hear presidential candidates on all sides of the political spectrum misuse issues around communities and police for political purposes, it undermines public safety and it undermines the strength of our democracy.
Caren, we started this conversation talking about how lack of faith in justice and in police can leak into other institutions. And, right here in Georgia, we think about that profoundly protracted election interference case that happened in this in this state. So important after 2020, and in many ways it's not wrapped up. There's much more left to go on it. But when you look at things here, how has that case shaped the public view of Justice Department, local institutions, the health of those institutions, do you think, especially with the very real possibility that we might have that happen all over again in this 2024 race?
Well, I think some of the problem has been, since the case was badly mismanaged, I was very impressed with the indictment. When it came out, I thought it was very encyclopedic. It really dealt with not only the high-ranking people, but also the election workers who had been so heavily harassed. And it sort of had a real sense of, this has done actual damage to our state and to people in our state, and to the rule of law. Unfortunately, because of just some poor judgment on the part of the DA, and refusing to kind of just say, yes, I had an affair with this guy, it's over
this
now.
This would be District Attorney Fani Willis,
and the guy who was the sort of chief assistant on the case. And that was just terrible. She lost a good 2 months and lost a lot of credibility. Meanwhile, the legislature has set up a sort of a prosecutor review board, which could potentially eventually stop the case. And it's. I think there's two things happening. There's, on one hand, I would say on the right, there's a sense that the justice system has been weaponized, because Trump says that all the time. It's a witch hunt, he's a scapegoat, all these types of things. And I think on the left, there's a disappointment with the Supreme Court, for one thing, particularly their decision that any official act is immune, which seems on its face completely ridiculous and absolutely not what the founders had in mind when they drafted the Constitution and stuff and formed the country. As well as certain judges and their decisions throughout, like the judge in Florida. And so I think there's a disillusionment with the justice system generally, and an extreme suspicion of it on the right, which keeps getting amplified, I think, as well.
Markel, any thoughts you want to add there? I mean, the communities you're talking to, probably just briefly, how have they reflected on all this? They've seen, I was just talking to Councilman Amir, about this idea of a kind of fatigue that lays in to swing states, to the voters who get visit after visit from these candidates. When you talk to communities around here in Georgia and so on, what kind of engagement do you find? How engaged are they in this election?
People are generally not as engaged as they were in previous elections, except for the fact that I think right-thinking Americans understand that a candidate like Donald Trump, who consistently stokes fear and anxiety, is bad for the country, and just generally speaking. So in a lot of ways, people are fed up with and discontent with a lot of everything that the professor just articulated, except Donald Trump will drive more people to the polls probably than anything else this election cycle, which is, for me, it's having been mentored by most of the icons that work very closely with Martin Luther King Jr., like Hosea Williams and John Lewis and Joseph Lowery and Andrew Young and others, who fought so that people of color and women could have equal access to our political systems in this country. It's kind of sad to me, but the truth of the matter is we've had for the last 12 years a candidate for president and a sitting president that did everything he could to cause this sort of disillusionment with our electoral system, which is incredibly dangerous for our democracy. So my hope and prayer, frankly, is that we're moving past the Trump era, and we can restore the sense of decency and dignity that has allowed us to move from segregation and discrimination as a matter of law to the places that we were when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. We've got to get past this moment.
Reverend Markel Hutchins, thank you so much, and Caren Morrison, thank you both for joining us here on the Beltline. This is the Monocle Daily. You're back with the Monocle Daily here on the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, as we approach the election, far away from the polls and the pundits, there is the story, what's happening on the ground. Well, I'm joined by our reporter, Poppy Damon, who has been on the road to Alabama, Georgia, and will be going to Pennsylvania tomorrow to speak to voters. But right now, Poppy, you're in New York. What's the mood of the voters you've been speaking to so far?
I am. Thank you for having me. I mean, it's really noticeable here that there is a lack of confidence on either side. I sense an edginess I've not really seen before. I mean, if you look at 2008, there was a huge momentum behind Obama that somewhat carried on into his second term. Long lines to cast votes and a general jubilant atmosphere. 2016, Trump galvanized the Republican vote in a similar way. Voters more than happy to don a MAGA hat and talk about how they hoped Trump would change things. This year, I'm sensing a sense of embarrassment, caution, fear, compromise that I keep hearing. I don't meet the evangelists on either side, particularly sure that they're going to win, which all points to, and I hate to say it because we hear it so much this election, but it is going to be incredibly close.
It's true, Poppy. You know, we talk so much at the moment about fears of, potential violence in the wake of the election and electoral interference and people casting doubt on the vote and so on. But only 6 months ago, they were talking about a double hater election where, frankly, voters weren't turned on by any candidate. Obviously, there's been a few changes since then. But I wonder, in terms of when you go out there, we hear so much about economy, security being these major issues. What else are you hearing people really sort of being enlivened by when candidates talk about it?
Yeah, well, I think the reversal of Roe v. Wade and abortion rights has become a major focus too. I was just in Peekskill, New York, where the debate is totally dominated by a proposed amendment to the state constitution. It's dubbed Proposition 1. A reminder to listeners that Americans are voting here on a lot more than just the presidency, because Proposition 1 is supposed to enshrine abortion law into state law, but it's led to fears that it protects gender as a specified category and that this could change the rules around trans people participating in women's sports. So even here on this issue, I found voters were hesitant about their positions, anxious about speaking to me as a reporter. And as you'll hear from one voter who I spoke to after she left the polling station, I asked whether she was voting for the amendment.
I vote no.
Why are you voting no?
A few reasons. Yeah, because it's very complicated and I'm undecided about some local candidates as well.
You can hear in her voice, Chris, that she was whispering as she spoke to me, which I've not had covering previous elections.
It's really fascinating. I mean, she's felt that she had to whisper to you. Extraordinary. Exactly. Trump has pledged to win New York back. I mean, this is a hard Democrat seat. Do you think he even has a vague chance of clawing something back that becomes headline worthy?
Well, look, not at the presidential level, but certainly in districts like Peekskill, we could see a Republican win, and gaining a majority in Congress is important if Mr. Trump wants to challenge the election result as he did in 2020. Democrats lost 5 competitive House races here in 22 at the midterm. So this 2024 election is a big chance to earn back what was once theirs. And a reminder that they only need a net gain of 4 seats nationwide, which would flip the House back to the control of the Democrats, which would be a huge coup.
It would indeed. I mean, of course, yes, we have to remember that there are other things being voted on here. You're going to be heading to Bucks County tomorrow in Pennsylvania for us, and I know we're going to talk more over the weekend, Poppy, but just tell us why that county is so important.
Yeah, it's a move that fits another pattern because in this election, Donald Trump's campaign has actually successfully sued Bucks County for turning away voters due to long lines and polling stations closing. A Pennsylvania judge on Wednesday sided with Donald Trump's campaign and agreed to extend on in-person voting. We want to go and see for ourselves what those lines are like when so many were saying they were disenfranchised before the judge's order. I used that word pattern because there was also a sense wherever we went that this won't be a smooth transition of power. I spoke to one judge in a swing county, Quitman County in Georgia, which will be hugely important in this race.
We're actually going to do a hand count on all ballots. Our county is going to do on all ballots. We're regulated to do it on a certain number of the ballots, but we will do a hand count on every ballot in Quitman County to make sure that the machines are correct.
Chris, I predict that on election night, all eyes will be on a small selection of areas like Quitman County, and disputes over these counts will be widespread.
Poppy Damon there, reporting from New York. Great to have you with us, Poppy, and her editor was Charlie Bell. I'm sure we'll hear much more from them in Pennsylvania in the days to come. And that's it for this special edition of the Monocle Daily, live from the Beltline in Atlanta. A big thank you to all my guests today. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Ribello. Our sound engineers were Sam Impey here in Atlanta and Mariella Belvin back in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. We're continuing to broadcast from here in Atlanta in the lead up to Election Day. Don't forget, we're going to be in DC, Washington, DC, the seat of power from Monday. You can follow all our coverage by subscribing to this podcast. I'm Christopher Lord. Goodbye and thanks for listening.